Hello everyone, my name is Max,
And mine is Joey.
and today we are here with the second episode of Grandpa Stories. Grandpa Stories was inspired by our three grandpas, who always seem to have an endless stream of comedic and interesting stories from their past.
This episode we will be talking to Max's grandpa, Mr. Jennings. Mr. Jennings is a retired naval veteran.
Throughout this podcast, we will dive into the stories Mr. Jennings has about his time in the Navy and Marines, and what life was like growing up in his time period.
Now to kick off the show, how are you doing today, Mr. Jennings?
Doing well. Does anybody know that I had a serious operation?
I knew that.
You knew that? Okay. Well, I'm doing, you were just here. I think I'm doing fine.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your early life and what it was like growing up?
Well, I was born in 1936, and so that was 5 years, 36, 4 years before Pearl Harbor. And I do remember as a 4 or 5 year old the announcement that Pearl Harbor had been invaded by the Japanese. And by that time on our East Coast, we had a lot of potential interference from German submarines. And we, living next to or on the coast, had to do a number of things to support the war effort. One of which was to blacken out all of our windows at night, so we had no light going out. And the second thing I remember is that we had to collect tin cans and other things like tin foil, and we had to bring them to the end of our street in Fairfield and put them in this gigantic pile, which they took away and used to create some implements for supporting the war. Beyond that, I do remember going to the movies every Saturday morning, and I think it cost us 25 cents. And when we went in, the first thing they showed was a summary of what was going on in the war. And then we may have had a movie that was a cartoon. And then we had what was the serial movie, so it would have been something like Superman, and we had to. It never finished in the first, 4 or 5 weeks as you saw it, because it got you back to pay another quarter to the movies in the next week, so you could see the next installment of this movie. I did walk to school in grammar school 1 through grade 1. I don't even know there was a kindergarten, but grades 1 through 4, I walked to school and home, and it was about a mile from my home, and walked it regardless of the weather. So, and I know I told Max that the next school that I went to, I had to walk uphill, and I walked uphill both coming and going to school.
Uphill both ways, Grandpa?
Yeah, uphill. It was uphill both ways to school.
Okay.
And so I walked it. It was about, that was maybe a mile and a half or 2 miles. And so I walked that in the summer and the winter, or spring and the winter, and the fall. So, those are the sorts of things I remember from early childhood.
Now, in your classes, what was your class size like, or your school size like? Because I know today we have a lot bigger schools than they did back when you were a kid.
Well, that's a great question. Man, nobody's ever asked me that before. I think in grammar school, the classes were probably somewhere between 15 and 20.
How many classes were there to your school, do you think?
What do you mean by classes? Classes that I went to, or
Just how many? So you said there's 15 to 20 students per class. Would that be the entire school,
okay.
or would
How many
that
of those
be?
15 to 20? Okay,
Yes.
how many of those 15 to 20? In the first first grammar school that I went to, it was a pretty good sized school. So my guess would be that grades one through 4, I think, is only I went to that school. I would say in that whole school of grades 1 through, I think it was 7 or 8 in those days, that there were probably 15 or 20 classes.
Oh, that's pretty big size.
Schools with students in them.
Yeah.
And then in the second grammar school that I went to, it was smaller, and it was still grades 1 through 8. And that school probably was at 10 or 12, I would say.
Mm. So, do you have any funny stories from your childhood?
Oh, I guess the only funny story I can tell you is it's not early childhood. It was more like teenage years. And Billy Banzak and I wanted to join the volunteer fire department. And we did. And in those days, my dad was the treasurer of the fire department, and he'd been in that job for a fairly significant number of years. And it was a summer day. And Billy and I decided that we wanted to go out to a fire. But we figured in order to go out to a fire, we might have to create one. So my father had this 1950-something brown Plymouth station wagon, one of the first all-metal station wagons that were made. And we put a can of gas in the back of the station wagon. And we drove out to this field that had to be, I think the field had to be 10 acres. And we put Billy in the back of the station wagon, and he was sitting on the tailgate, and we wrapped a little rag around the end of an arrow in the gasoline, and we lit it on fire. And he shot this arrow over the tree line by the road we were on, and it landed out in the middle of this field. The field caught fire, and we thought, oh man, somebody's going to call us in. So we quickly drove back to the firehouse, and we sat there waiting for somebody to call in so we could get on the back of the fire truck and go to the fire and put it out. We sat. Nothing ever happened. Nobody ever called this fire in. The whole 10 acres burned off. And that was the end of it. The next day, we drove up there to see what was going on. All we saw was a burned out field. But it's a good thing my father never found out about it, because he would have given me a kick in the butt so hard I would have come down with snow on my head.
Now to transition a little bit, so when did you serve in the military?
Well, I went to St. Lawrence University, and I did join it would have been 1954. I joined the Army, the first 2 years of Army ROTC. And you know what ROTC means, right? Reserve Officer Training Corps. And I did the first 2 years, and I decided, I didn't want the Army. My junior and senior year, I decided that I would rather go into the Navy. So I didn't choose to go into the Army for the last 2 years, and when I graduated, I applied to the Navy Officer Candidate School, which is conducted in Newport, Rhode Island, and I was accepted. And I went there, and I was eventually commissioned in May 1st of 1959 as an ensign in the Navy, which is the lowest level officer that you can be in that service or any other service. They call them something different, but it was the lowest officer level in the United States Navy. And I did tell the officer who, after 3 of the 4 months of officer candidate school, when they called you in and asked you what you wanted to do in the Navy, I made the mistake of telling them I wanted to play baseball because I played baseball in St. Lawrence. That was not a very smart thing to say because that officer was very mad at me. So then I asked for a PT boat, and he said we don't have any. And I asked him for a minesweeper because I wanted something small. And he said, there are no officers on minesweepers. I finally said, give me a destroyer. So they gave me the USS Benham, which was a destroyer, one of 175 destroyers that were built in World War II. Mine was built on Staten Island in New York. And after it was built and commissioned, the commission means sent to the Navy, and officially they sent it to Pearl Harbor. And after some training, the ship was sent out to the Pacific from the spring of 1944 to the end of the war. Participated in a lot of the island hopping battles, if you guys are familiar with those, and participated in a lot of those island hopping battles leading to the final surrender after an atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. And the ship was present in the harbor of Japan, Tokyo Harbor, and was very near the USS Missouri, which is where the surrender was signed. And I was on the ship from 1959 to 1960, and it was deployed to the Mediterranean for 6 months, and we were there as part of a squadron of 8 destroyers that were in support of protecting an aircraft carrier. And they did, they detached us from the Sixth Fleet and sent us through on a very interesting mission, sent us through the Suez Canal and went down in the Red Sea. Look on a map, you guys, this is where all that stuff is going on over there now. Down the Red Sea, around Yemen and Saudi Arabia, up into the Persian Gulf, through the Straits of Hormuz, to the country of Kuwait. And you might be interested in the fact that this is the Cold War now, so nobody's shooting at us. So we get to Kuwait, and they call all the officers into the wardroom, and that's the wardroom is a place where all the officers eat. And interestingly, the wardroom table acts as an operating table in case of serious injury during in wartime. At any rate, got in there, and a bunch of people from the British Petroleum Oil Company, who were essentially running Kuwait at the time, came, and they gave each of us a sheet of papers, 8.5 by 14, and each of these pages was filled with the activities that we were supposed to engage in during the course of the 4 days we were there. And if I can remember, I may not remember all of the activities that we were involved, but we had about an hour and a half to formed the following teams: tennis, rifle, pistol shooting, cricket, swimming, diving, water polo, swimming races, golf. Did I say tennis? I think tennis.
I believe so.
And there were others, but you get the idea. There were a lot of teams that we had to form in about an hour and a half. And
Wow.
the last item on the agenda was a 20-man drinking party. A 20-man party had to go to their club from 8 in the morning till 2 in the next morning. And if any of your people came back to the ship, somebody from under your responsibility had to go over and take his place.
That was 18 hours.
After 4 days, even sailors wanted to go back to sea. It was a tough deal.
So, what were your responsibilities aboard the USS Benham?
One of the things that happened right after I got aboard the ship was they sent me to Key West, Florida to become an anti-submarine warfare officer. That took 2 months. The ship had already departed to the Mediterranean, so I had to fly over and find it, which I finally did in Palermo, Sicily. And the other major duty on board ship for officers, and most people don't even know this, that officers stand underway, means the ship's going through the water, watches on the bridge, and they are, in effect, the captain of the ship while they're on the bridge. Now, having said that, the captain's always the captain, and he's always responsible. But you need to know what you're doing, because you are the guy in charge on the bridge and taking care that the ship does what it's supposed to do and not injure the 250 odd people who are sleeping at night aboard below decks. And so that's a huge responsibility in my mind. I was 23 years old. How do you get that kind of responsibility to a 23-year-old? Well, in the Navy they do, and they still do today. So and I had a couple of collateral duties, the principal one of which was a special services officer on the ship, and that turned out to be somewhat interesting duty, because I had to arrange, after we had been at sea for 30 days or more, I think I had to arrange a party at a bar in Spain. And I had to go find some guy that ran a bar that knew how to speak English. So I got off the ship and I found it. We had, and you can only, in the foreign ports, you can only let half the people on the ship go on liberty. No, you can only let, sorry about that. You can only let a third of the people go in a foreign port. And in a domestic port, like home here, you can let half the ship go. But you need to have 2/3 of the ship, of the manpower on the ship available to get the ship underway in an emergency.
So, what would you and your crew members do for fun on board the ship?
There's very little to do for fun aboard a small destroyer. This is not like an aircraft carrier. This thing was only 376 feet long. And the only fun that I can remember was just before we were due to come back to Newport after serving for 6 months. We had a picnic on the fantail of the ship. That's the stern of the ship. And there was like a half an oil barrel that somebody had. I didn't even know we had it. One was to guard the aircraft carrier, because the destroyer is a lot less important than an aircraft carrier, and to look out for submarines. And we think we encountered a Soviet submarine, a Russian submarine, probably a nuclear submarine, and we chased it for a while, and it decided it didn't want to screw around with us anymore, so it took off, because it could go faster underwater than we could go on the surface. But we were at sea all the time, because the aircraft carrier was conducting air operations, and when they conduct air operations, you have to have two of the destroyers standing by to pick up pilots if they screwed up on landing or takeoff. And so we were doing that all the time, day and night.
Huh.
So we were seldom in port, and when we were in port, we were there for a very short period of time.
So, what was the food and sleeping situation like aboard the ship?
Well, aboard ship, the enlisted people are separated from the officers and the chief petty officers. That's the highest rank that an enlisted person can get to, but they're special people. And so even on a destroyer, we had a section that was called Officers' Country, and that's where we had I hate to call it a stateroom, but that's what it was called, and it was, not too much larger than a very large broom closet. And in wartime, there would have been two of us in there, and in peacetime they didn't put all the people on the ship that you would in wartime, and so I had a stateroom all to myself, and most of the other guys did too, except when we were over the Mediterranean. You'll love this. The carrier, there was a chaplain on the carrier, and he would spend a couple of weeks on each of the destroyers. And so when they sent him over to our destroyer, the executive officer thought it'd be a good idea to have him room with Jennings. So this one morning, we were to go into, I think it was Barcelona, Spain, and the uniform of the day was dress blues. So I put on my uniform and went up, and I had the 8 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock watch. So I had to get up pretty early and get up to the boardroom and get some breakfast. And I got up there, and I'm in my uniform, and the stewards are all snickering, and they're all kind of laughing with one another. I didn't know what the hell was going on. So I happened to look down at my sleeve, and instead of seeing a star on the sleeve of my dress blues, I saw a cross. So I knew I had taken his jacket and put it out in the wardrobe, and I jumped up out of my seat and ran down to my stateroom and put on the proper uniform and came back. But after that, all of the enlisted people referred to me as a Rev. I'll never forget that. That was embarrassing. But eventually, they brought him back to the carrier and put him on some other destroyer. And so I was okay. He had his own jacket with him.
Do you have any funny stories from the Navy or the Marines?
Oh, I can tell you one funny story that I had nothing to do with, but the year before I got on the ship went to the Mediterranean again, and the officers were invited to some sheikh's residence in the Middle East. and they were served. I don't know they were served alcohol. I don't think they used alcohol over there, but they did. They were served appetizers. You know what they were?
What were they?
Sheep's eyeballs.
Sheep? Oh. Yummy.
And I said, I'm glad I was not on that cruise.
Yeah.
Not something that I would swim up to.
Yeah, that does not sound very appetizing.
No, I don't think so. But apparently over there it was a delicacy. I wouldn't call them funny things, but a couple of scary things a little bit. My job there was to supply naval gunfire to Marines as they made a landing, because obviously you couldn't get cannons, howitzers ashore immediately if you were making a landing against an enemy, and the artillery became the naval guns. So my job was to plan shore bombardment prior to a landing, and then to supply naval gunfire after the landing occurred. I served at a time when the Cold War was going on, but Vietnam was beginning to heat up. And I remember this one mission's not quite right, one exercise that we went on at Camp Pendleton, but it was designed to be something that might occur in Vietnam. And there were a couple of things that happened. So one of the pieces of equipment that my unit had was a radio, a Jeep with a radio in it to contact aircraft. But it was the vehicle that I went to and from the field in. And normally what happened is that we would go to the mess hall of the Marine Infantry Battalion that we supported and pick up bags for lunch, after which the meals would all be brought out in these big thermos vats, and we would have hot meals after that, and they were actually pretty good. But anyway, the bags came back, and the guy that drove the Jeep for me was a guy by the name of Corporal Dempsey. I don't remember his first name, but he was a piece of work. So he goes into the mess hall, and he comes back with this cardboard box with paper bags in it. And he says, here's our lunch, Mr. Jennings. And I said, okay, fine, put it in the back of the Jeep, let's go. He said, no, you don't understand. This is our meal. And I said, what do you mean this is our meal? He says, this is what we're going to have to eat for a week. I said, what? He said, give me one of those bags. And I opened up one of the bags, and there were a couple of tea bags and some jelly beans and a couple of fistfuls of rice, some bouillon. And those are the things I remember. There might have been some other things. And nobody knew how to cook rice. And I don't know, maybe you guys don't know how to do it either. But
I can cook rice.
When you cook rice, you have to do something that's called blanching. It means you rinse it off or something. Well, all this handful of rice came out like a freaking snowball. Hard as hell. And we didn't know what to do with it. So we didn't eat a whole lot during that week, except for the guys that were pretty smart. They went out and they would, Camp Pendleton now, they would catch, and there were two things. They would, first of all, they'd catch rattlesnakes, and they'd skin them and cook them and eat them. I didn't have any rattlesnake meat. But the other thing was that on the you after that week, how many cantaloupes do you think were made in those fields after our guys went in there and ate them all?
I'd say not a lot. Maybe one.
And the ones that
Maybe.
made were probably not right. And I think probably the federal government probably had to pay those farmers something in order to compensate for what we all did in that thing. But the idea was that in Vietnam, they thought small patrols would be going out and they'd have to carry their food for anywhere from 3 days to a week. And so they gave us these bags, paper bags full of the things that I described, and expected us to live on that. I think we all lost 10 or 12 pounds during that week.
Wow.
And when we finally got back into garrison and home, and I know that the guys that were with me, we went out and got the biggest steaks we could find in the local restaurants. And I remember it was very good.
So we're going to start wrapping it up just a little bit. We've got 3, I guess, cheesy questions.
Okay, line them up.
What is one takeaway you have from your military experiences?
Okay, I have a good one there. I will tell you something that happened when I was with the Marines. First of all, if you're aboard ship, obviously you're getting 3 meals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all you have to do is show up on the mess deck, and you get a meal.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't necessarily be the case when you're in the field with the Marines. So the very first time I went on an exercise with the Marines, and the officers were all eating in a separate location from the enlisted people, the commanding officer of the battalion, who was a full-bird colonel, came over to me and he said, "Are your naval gunfire people fed?" And I told him, "I don't know. I presume they would get in line somewhere and get some food." Well, this guy beat the crap out of me. I don't mean literally, but verbally. Beat the crap out of me, and he said, "You make sure from now on that your people are fed well before you even think about eating a meal." Well, that was something that has stayed with me for a long time. You take care of your people first.
That's a good lesson.
That's obviously more difficult to do if you're in the field with the Marines as opposed to everybody's aboard the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're at sea, where the hell are they going to go?
Mm-hmm.
There's nowhere they're going to go unless they jump over the side, which nobody did. So that was one thing I learned. You always take care of your people. And it's not something that I wasn't certainly aware of. I just didn't think of it because it was a totally different situation. But I never forgot that lesson.
That's a good lesson.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you guys should remember that too.
We will.
If you're in a leadership position, you've got to take care of your people.
So, next cheesy question. If you could give any one piece of advice to the people of the younger generation, what would it be?
Well, certainly if you're in a leadership position, you take care of your people. Other than that, I would go to one of the items, and I think, Max, you've read this book, right? You read the book Make Your Bed?
I think so.
And you might even bring that book to class. I don't know, but without getting into what that book was all about, I think one of the pieces of advice that I would give would be to connect yourself to a mentor who can advise you, keep you on the straight and narrow, and maybe make some connections for you or things like that. And that's one of the things in that book. You may have to go to Max, you may have to go to the book. I think you have a copy of it there.
I think so.
Nate has it, I don't know, but you may have to go and do a little research in that book on the things that Admiral, I can't think of his last name, Admiral, anyway, the guy that wrote the book, Make Your Bed. That's one of the things he said, I think, that is important for all young people to do.
That's good advice. I like that.
Yeah. What is one thing that you wish you knew when you were growing up that you didn't?
Oh, boy. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I think I did pretty much everything I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to go to college. I knew that when I got there, I wanted to play baseball. I knew I didn't want to go into the Army. I knew I wanted to go into the Navy. And when I got out, I made application in Connecticut to a number of companies, but went to work for a bank that for a number of years made me very happy. So I can't think of anything that I would do a lot. I mean, there may be some small things, but I don't think there's any big thing that I would do differently.
So it sounds like you kind of just had your plan and stuck to it. You knew what you wanted.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think that's right.
Oh, awesome. That might have to wrap up this episode. Thank you for talking, Grandpa Ray, Mr. Jennings.
Joey and Maxwell, I had fun talking with you guys. It was fun. Thanks for interviewing me.
Yeah, thanks for showing up.
Take care, guys.
Thanks, you too. So today with Mr. Jennings, my grandpa, we talked about his early life growing up and what that was like, his time in both the Navy and Marines, some funny stories about his childhood and his time in the military, and we heard a little bit about his life advice for people of the younger generation.
Thanks a lot for tuning in to Grandpa Stories. The next episode is in the works now.
See you guys next time on Grandpa Stories.